Ladies and gentlemen, and now we'll begin the technology session 1, Climate Stabilization Technologies. First of all, I would like to introduce two moderators for this session. First of all, Professor Dr. Nebojša Nakčanović, ICEF Steering Committee, Vice Chair of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Commission. Honorary and Emeritus Scholar, International Institute for Applied System Analysis. Emeritus Professor of Energy Economics, Vienna University of Technology. And Professor Dr. Reiko Kuroda, ICEF Steering Committee, Designated Professor, Frontier Research Institute, Chubu University. Professor Emeritus, the University of Tokyo, member of G7 GIAC 2023. And now I would like to ask Professor Nakčanović to moderate this session. So now, please take the floor.
Good afternoon. Warm welcome to this technology session number 1 on carbon dioxide removal and other climate stabilization options. And I think that the proceedings of this morning and afternoon have set a wonderful stage for our discussion. It is, in fact, one of the topics that we did not discuss all that much this morning. So it is a real great privilege and pleasure to co-moderate this session with Reiko. We will try to manage the discussion. We have 3 really prominent speakers on the topic. They will be speaking about 7 minutes each. And then afterwards, we should have about half an hour for the discussion and the question and answer from the audience. We'll also try to get some questions from the internet because we have lots of participants from the internet. Warm welcome to them as well. So please think about the questions as you listen to the presentations. But since as usual, 1 hour will not be enough for this important topic, so with no further ado, please allow me to make just few opening remarks, and then we will go to Reiko and to the speakers. So first of all, as you've heard this morning, there is a huge, almost Herculean challenge to achieve the aspirational goals of the Paris Agreement. And Johan has referred to that, and Husong as well in their presentations. Basically, to achieve 1.5 degree stabilization, we need to halve the emissions every decade. I mean, one can call that the carbon law, and toward net zero by the middle of the century. And also, as you have heard this afternoon, after lunch, we are not on that track. We are very far from that track. And, European Commission would like to have a 90% reduction by 2040 after achieving 55% by 2030. But this is a really tall order, and we would need to do that worldwide. So we are late with the emissions reduction, and we will most likely, and Husong has referred to that, overshoot the targets. That means we will have excess emissions that would need to be removed. And this is why the need for net negative emissions. So that's what our session is really about. Mother Earth, the nature is very kind to us. The planet removes already half of the emissions that we emit every year. So we can enhance that. This would be the nature-based solutions like afforestation, reforestation, but we will be discussing also other technological means of directly capturing carbon from the atmosphere. And at this point, maybe I should just remind all of you that ICEF publishes every year a roadmap, and we already had 2 roadmaps that David coordinated exactly on this topic. There was in 2020, the roadmap on biomass carbon removal and storage, an important technology, and in 2018 on direct air capture. So we will be discussing those. But then the question is, what happens if we miss also those targets? And one of the old ideas has been revamped and has entered the discussion recently, namely managing solar radiation. That means reflecting some of the sunlight directly or indirectly from the planet, and thereby masking the global warming that would occur through the increase of the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. But in this case, we should not forget that we are not resolving the problem. We are basically masking the problem because, for example, ocean acidification would continue occurring. So I think these are the challenges for our session. We'll be discussing that, and I know that our speakers are the top experts on this topic, so I do not want to delay the discussion any further. I would like to give the floor to Reiko.
Okay, there's not much to add, but we all know the climate change, hurricanes, rainfall, forest fires, so this is really the time we have to think. And what the Rockstrom said this morning, window is not closed, but it's getting closed. It's just still open. So we have to do something. Just the ordinary emission mitigation may not be good enough. So we have to start the new technology, although that may not be established. So we have to discuss. And we are going to have 3 really exciting talks about the technology, how to achieve the emission gas GHG reduction. So perhaps you're going to introduce the first speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Reiko. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Hidetaka Yamada, who is the professor at Kanazawa University, and he'll be talking about carbon dioxide removal, and we'll cover the whole range of technologies, including direct removal and other systems. But maybe on the personal note, let me say that we are both colleagues. We both worked at RITE, the Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth, at different times, of course, but we have a common history here. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to talk about carbon dioxide removal. Can I see? Okay. Carbon dioxide removal. And first, I will mention the roles of carbon dioxide removal, and I will introduce CDR technologies options, and then I will focus on the direct air capture DAC, and finally I will end of my speech by presenting challenges, problems, and risks in CDR deployment. So let's first look at the roles of CDR. When you consider the roles of CDR, you have to also consider what mitigation scenario is assumed. And if it is a net zero emissions scenario, CDRs are always required. And on the right side of this slide, you can see global CO2 capture by source in 2020 to 2050. In 2050, we will capture, in this scenario, about 7.6 gigatons of CO2 will be captured in 2050 in the world. And among these, about 2 gigatons of CO2 will be captured from biomass sector and directly from air, which contribute to CDR and as BECS and DAX. So there are other CDR options. This slide shows the CDR technologies listed according to where the CO2 is fixed. And that's biomass, soil, geological reservoirs, minerals, and ocean. Afforestation, reforestation, and blue carbon management are nature-based solutions. DAX and BECS are engineering-based solutions in which the captured CO2 is stored deep underground. Biochar and the enhanced weathering are hybrid solutions. So this table shows TRLs, cost and mitigation potentials of each CDR method reported by IPCC Working Group 3. you can see that afforestation, reforestation, and soil carbon sequestration show high TRLs, while enhanced weathering and ocean-based solutions are at low TRLs. When you look at engineering-based solutions, BECS and DACs, they have medium TRLs, and BECS and DACs require high cost. However, what is promising about this technology is mitigation potential. Furthermore, monitoring, reporting, and verification of DACs is easy and clear. This feature is reason why DACs is becoming increasingly popular. In this slide, I will focus on direct air capture. Two famous startups, Carbon Engineering and Climeworks, were founded in 2009. It is true that they have challenges with high energy consumption and cost. They are rapidly scaling up their facility of CO2 capture in recent years. The driving force of such big project is the presence of purchasers such as Microsoft. Moreover, the United States and other countries have made a significant commitment to promoting that project. In Japan, METI and LIGHT are also working to provide efficient support for DAC and other CDRs. In the last, I would like to mention briefly the challenges, problems, and risks in CDR deployment. The biggest obstacle to deployment is cost. So we need there are a need for technological innovation that reduces energy consumption and footprint requirement or others. And scaling up is also a big challenge. Ongoing scaling up plans may reach megaton scale DACs after between 2025 and 2030. However, such scale up is unprecedented compared with conventional industries, so we cannot be optimistic. So there are also concerns regarding natural conservation. So it may not be easy for them to gain public acceptance. A final risk is that CDR may delay CO2 emission reductions. This is certainly a risk, but misunderstanding of this risk may delay CDR deployment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also for keeping on time and for this exceedingly comprehensive overview of the technology. Yeah, I think one of the big challenges, I think, as Huson has mentioned earlier today, is that most of the scenarios that stabilize at 1.5 degrees require quite a lot of net negative emissions on the order of hundreds of gigatons, and scale up will be a challenge that you mentioned, so maybe we can return to that topic in the discussion. But now our second speaker is Simone Tilmes. Simone is a project scientist at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Simone is joining us by internet from Colorado, I believe, and also saving thereby some emissions. And we will be going to completely different set of technologies. So rather than removing carbon from the atmosphere to avoid the warming, these are the technologies that will produce cooling by active intervention in the atmosphere. So Simone, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and sorry I cannot be here in person. So yeah, I will talk about solar radiation modification. And so you already mentioned the motivation for climate intervention. And as we know, the planet is warming in an unprecedented way. We do see more and more impacts. And we also know that this warming is going to continue until we actually reach about net zero emissions. And therefore, we really are not on track on our policy pledges, which of course increases the risk for reaching climate tipping points in the future. So the question that we're addressing is, should we consider here solar radiation modification as one of the climate responses to help reduce some of the projected future impacts, besides and in addition to ambitious mitigation and carbon dioxide removal? And so what I want to talk about is the methods. In the next, sorry, here we go. So usually or often the application of solar radiation modification is illustrated in a peak shaving scenario that you can see here. The idea is to use SRM basically as a stopgap measure to prevent an overshoot of surface temperatures through a certain threshold, while at the same time having aggressive mitigation and CDR in place. And so these different methods that can be potentially ramped into the time to reduce these temperatures are shown here on the right. So I go briefly through those. For instance, we can start with the surface albedo enhancement. So basically, solar radiation management, as we heard before, the idea is to increase the reflectivity of the planet, and we can do it through certain ways. The surface albedo enhancement would only try to increase really surfaces, and that's not very likely to be efficient enough to reach global cooling. But the next is the marine cloud brightening, which is researched a lot these days. And what would happen is that we would inject sea salt to increase the brightness of clouds. But also this technology, it isn't clear really how efficient this can be and how much we can achieve in terms of cooling. And other cloud-based methods are also very uncertain at this point. So the most promising method at this point is the stratospheric aerosol intervention method, where we would inject aerosols way up into the stratosphere where they are not polluting the environment. And so similar to volcanic eruptions, SAI could be able to counter some of the warming within a few years of implementation. And so there's also the space-based methods like sunshades that can be developed, but it will be still a long time before they can be set into place. And they are also thought to be very expensive. And so thinking about really what is the research that we need, what we really need, and we proposed in a recent paper, is that we need to assess SAI or other solar radiation modification methods through various criteria. And so we discussed that an assessment really needs to be interdisciplinary and internationally coordinated and needs to address three main themes, which is technical design requirements, response and impacts, and social science. And so if we go to the topics, starting with the technical design requirements, this, for instance, covers the technical and economical limitations. So how fast could we actually implement these methods? And it is thought that it will take at least 10 years, for example, before SAI could be started and slowly ramped up. But then also we need to think about what is the radiative cooling potential. And at this point, there's actually quite a bit of an uncertainty from recent model studies, from state-of-the-art climate models that see about a factor of 2 uncertainty in the cooling potential of this methodology. So saying if we, for instance, would inject 10 teragram of SO2 per year, some models reach a cooling of only or less than ½ degree, while others reach a cooling of over 1 degree. So this uncertainty still has to be reduced in much more research. Sorry, I go back. And so also it is important to really understand how much can we actually control the regional climate. Other things also include monitoring, detectability, and attribution. And so the next topic covers then also the responses and impacts. And what we have to address is the large-scale and regional scale climate impacts, as well as the impacts on the human and the natural system. And so while we can see in global models that SAI, for example, can globally cool the planet, there are large regional differences in climate impacts. And one example is shown here is the rainfall during the Indian summer monsoon. And that can differ largely within different models. So the problem is if we don't know exactly what is happening regionally, it is hard to predict what the implication on societies may be. Another gap of understanding really is the impacts on the biodiversity. And you can see here various processes that may interact on the biodiversity. So what we really need is much more interdisciplinary research and a strong theoretical and much more deeper understanding also from experimental understanding. Sorry, my slides went the wrong way. So, and the last thing is really then the social risks. And I know that that will be covered in the next presentation. So very quickly, what we had covered here was really that we need to consider social risks like moral hazard, as well as mitigation of risk through governance. And the question is, should we actually require a global commitment to a phase-out of fossil fuels before any of those methods could be considered as an example? Well, I want to stop here with my presentation since this will be covered next, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation discipline. This was also just 7 minutes. And I think a great presentation of the potential benefits, but also potential risks because of the huge uncertainty about this technology. And maybe on a more personal note, perhaps you heard in the introduction, I'm one of the 7 chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, and we have been asked by the Commission to provide policy recommendation on SRM. And it's probably one of the most controversial studies and recommendations I've been ever involved in. So I hope we can take up some of those questions in the discussion later on. But now, with no further ado, let's go to our third speaker, Holly Buck. She's a professor at the Department of Environment and Sustainability at University of Buffalo. And as Simone already said, Holly will also tackle the issue of social dimensions of carbon removal and SRM technology. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm a social scientist. I do empirical research like focus groups, interviews, surveys to better understand how people think about climate intervention. And today I'm going to provide a little bit of context about public understanding and governance. Starting with a brief history of how this has been researched. So in the 2010s, there was this paradigm of interdisciplinary research that was really focused on assessing the risks and the feasibility of these technologies. And that was supported by a few modest government-funded programs in the UK and Germany and other places. And so the emphasis was on understanding the safety and so on. And then carbon removal and solar geoengineering split apart a bit. Carbon removal became quite mainstream to the point where you see it in, for example, long-term strategies. This is the strategy of the US, and it has about 500 million tons of industrial CO2 removal technologies, as well as increases in the land sink. And so because of this modeling of how we could reach net zero and these new commitments, carbon removal became a field and maybe even an industry in its own right. And so the policy focus has really been on what will it take to scale these technologies. The conversations aren't so much about assessing them in this kind of risk-based paradigm. And so in the US, for example, we've had this question of how do we move from this large-scale modeling to actually realizing deployment. My colleague here mentioned the direct air capture hubs, which is a $3.5 billion program that funds several different technological readiness level type projects, a lot of feasibility studies, and then these two larger scale projects as well. One of them being in the state of Louisiana, Project Cypress Direct Air Capture Hub. And so they do have a community benefits framework. There's some requirements when the Department of Energy funds these projects that they think about how the projects could benefit communities, what sorts of labor, environmental justice, public engagement will be involved, and so on. But it's a big challenge in a state like Louisiana, which has a lot of impacts already from the petrochemical and other industries that are felt disproportionately. And so it's become rather controversial, direct air capture in particular, but also other types of carbon capture, blue hydrogen, so on. In part, related to the risks of the transportation. So in 2020, there was a CO2 pipeline rupture in the state of Mississippi, which some people went to the hospital, they became unconscious while driving. And CO2 pipelines compared to other sorts of pipelines actually have a pretty robust safety record. We have several decades of data in the US from our pipeline network, but you can show people that data, but what really captures people is the stories that they hear of stories like these folks who experienced devastating impacts from this. So this has become a big part of the conversation as these technologies move from a conceptual level to actually towards deployment. And so people are thinking a lot about this. I'll just move on to some of the higher level social challenges for carbon removal. One is that it's conflated with projects that are controversial in other areas that maybe have not had a lot of good engagement. People are especially concerned that poor communities and communities of color will bear negative impacts from these projects. And I'm concerned personally in my assessment that the social backlash to these technologies will impact our industrial decarbonization goals. I think there's really important lessons that other countries can take from this about the importance of early public engagement. And I do wonder if this could have been avoided a little bit by really demonstrating that risk assessment research that has been done, but maybe isn't communicated to these communities, and better integrating the social dimensions research. And these are quite local things. Like you can see the people in these rooms going to a community meeting, and it's a local discussion about what will happen really in their town or their parish. But it has international impacts, especially if other countries need blue hydrogen and so forth for their own decarbonization goals. So I'll move on to just a couple minutes, 2 minutes on solar radiation management, about the status of the research, the social science, and the governance. So previously, as I mentioned, we had government funding a little bit here and there to assess risks, but especially in the past year, we're in a new paradigm of privately funded research on this. We've had pretty big commitments from a few major foundations, totaling at least $100 million, mostly for the scientific research. The UK just has a new call for proposals that will be 56.8 million pounds. And so the question here is, will this follow the recommended design, for example, from the US National Academies. Dr. Tilmes had a similar diagram where the engagement, the research, and the governance move forward together, or are we looking at a patchwork of privately funded efforts that aren't funding social science research and engagement and governance at the same time? We do have a little bit of social science research on this, several dozen studies. Public awareness of solar radiation modification is low. There's often ambivalent support where there may be reluctant acceptance of the need for research, but a whole bunch of concerns, some of which have already been identified in this panel, but also the public is worried about this. And even though we have some initial survey results that say support for these technologies is higher in the Global South, public perceptions could rapidly change when people become more familiar. So, final points here on my last slide. The governance right now is pretty limited, but informal collaboration and coordination on research can really help. There have been a couple of government attempts that we may talk about that have been not so successful, and I really hope that we can have more international collaboration on all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it is really essential that in your contribution to our discussions this afternoon, you pointed out to the risks and also perception issues. In reviewing the literature, my impression completely confirms what you said, is there is also some dichotomy between researchers who are working on technologies and implementation and deployment, and researchers who are looking more on the social and human dimensions of acceptability. And it's not just the pipelines, the storage itself. If you take Husong's number of 200 gigatons and you have a leakage of 1%, you're ruining the whole strategy. So at all stages of the system, we have huge challenges. So I think there is lots of material for discussion, but before we go to discussion, and it's brilliant, we have exactly half an hour, I would like to remind all of you here in auditorium, please think of the questions. We would like to have an interactive session. And also those of you who are on the internet, I see already one question over internet, so we are moving in the right direction. But Reiko, do you have a question? Let's start with you.
Thank you. I think these three talks are really good because we sometimes feel, why should we do that aggressive mitigation or CDR? But because we are in that stage. And also the last talkers also warned us, everyone talked about the moral hazard, but the last talk particularly focused on the social issues. That is very important. So we start talking about LC, ethical, legal, social issues, and RI. And these are important things all the frontier engineers and scientists have to think about it. But this is particularly important because it's massive influence it will give to human beings, but not only that, for the all ecosystems. Maybe even in bacterium, we don't see bacteria, but we need it in a gut, but also in the soil. Without all these sort of cycles, so we have to think about the ecosystem that include not only living things, but the non-living things as well, water, CO, CO2, and nitrogen. So we have to think all about this. So that is very good. But, so here in the last talk, I want to ask the first two speakers how you feel about the talk. So the Yamada-san, how do you think?
So I also pointed out in the last moral hazard, but I think maybe we can. So first important thing is what strategy we assume. If we need a net zero emission scenario, so as I told, we need some CDR more or less. But before that, we can agree that carbon dioxide reduction is needed. And then a small amount of CDR may be needed. We may agree that. So first point is ratio of CDR per reduction should be small at first. But as a scientist, should try to get large potential from CDR technologies, because that can be used not only to CDR. For example, direct capture can be used to obtain carbon sources to make something. So my point is that to agree by everyone, we should try to ratio of CDR should be small as possible. Okay?
Simone?
Yeah, I can
thank you.
comment on the first point, which is really the social perception that was really nicely outlined. It is really difficult when we see all the side effects of the different technologies and people worry. But one thing that I'm also think we really need to keep in mind is that climate change right now is impacting so many societies, and that so many more impacts we're seeing constantly in the news. We see everywhere things are happening. You know, now even just in Florida, a huge, massive hurricane is gonna reach, you know, the country, and everywhere in the world, people suffering. So those things need to put always also in perspective and the impacts of, you know, the other technologies. Because we have risks in both sides. We really need to assess them and understand what can we actually gain from one technology, what can we really, the most important thing we all know is to have the awareness that people understand that climate change is caused by fossil fuel emissions, and those have to be stopped. And that's the main part. I think it always has to be put in perspective. The other thing, I think it's really great to really bring social and physical science together. We also pointed that out. It is an important part to have the communication to really allow the understanding, not only from saying physical scientists explain their ideas to social scientists, but really the understanding and the exchange in both sides will help a lot, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Holly, would you like to respond as well?
Yeah, I mean, and the moral hazard question, I'm less concerned about it with carbon removal, partly because large-scale carbon removal presumes abundant, affordable, renewable energy if you want to make the life cycle balance work out, and also because we have so many other things that are delaying mitigation that carbon removal might be on that list, but it probably wouldn't be on the top of the list. I'm much more concerned about it when it comes to solar radiation modification. And my invitation would be that instead of thinking about moral hazard or mitigation deterrence in a very general way, we could think more specifically about phase-out deterrence. I think that can sharpen our thinking a little bit there. And also, I agree with Dr. Tilmes completely about the need to evaluate these different trade-offs among different kinds of risks. Right now, a lot of our engagement will be about a technology, but not about the different pathways that we're on.
I'm wondering whether there are any questions from the audience. There is one in the back. Can you please state your name, and maybe you can just get up so we can see you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Shinichi Asayama from National Institute of Public Studies in Japan. I have a question to Simone. So you have been working on a lot in modeling research on SLM. And recently, SLM is increasingly framed into to avoid tipping points, climate tipping points, like AMOX and like West Antarctic ice sheets or Greenland ice sheets. So I'm just wondering about what do you think about the potential role of SRM to avoiding tipping points. Do you think it's a feasible idea to do that, or maybe like what kind of the tipping points might be like more important if we think about to potential deployment SRM in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I can answer that. I think there are different tipping points that we can think about. And some things that can be potentially reduced with a SAI or other SRM methods, while others may not. For example, we already know what SAI or solar radiation management may do is to keep temperature at a certain level, maybe reduce temperature to some degree. But how much we can actually do is still the question. We cannot drastically reduce the temperature that various tipping points can be reversed. Some tipping points have already been initiated. Melting of glaciers. These are processes that happen over many, many long time scales. And initiated melting has already taken place. It is therefore not really clear if or how much SRM had to be done to really stop or reduce this. And that's also the same with, say, the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, as an important process that keeps the weather like we have in Europe warmer, for example. And so if this has already slowed down, it isn't clear, and models don't actually necessarily show if a trend can be reversed. There's still a lot of uncertainty because we don't know really how fast, for example, how much could be done, but also it depends on how different technology would be applied. And many people have already said that if we, for example, apply these solar radiation modification strategies much too late when warming has already occurred in an extended way, some of the tipping points certainly cannot be, or not certainly, but potentially cannot be reversed. So that's really the question. Temperature-related things can help, but how much they can reverse is another question. So I would say these technologies can help to reduce impacts, but probably they would not completely solve the problem in that sense. I hope that answers the question.
I think this is a really important point that you made, Simone, and it cannot be stressed enough. Mitigation adaptation is number one, and it's a must. And if these technologies like CDR and SRM should work sometimes in the future, they would be in addition. They would be kind of additional to catalyze further change. But mitigation adaptation still needs to be number one, and I think that's related also to our moral hazard issue. Maybe we can come back to that again. But I just wonder whether there are some other questions from the audience at this point. Okay, so if you think of a question, please ask, but I might, if I may, I would also like to ask you a question going back to Václav's presentation. If you remember, he talked about the scale-up as being the major challenge. And if we look at these technologies, CDR exists at the pilot level. We have seen that in the presentation quite clearly, but it has not been scaled up. And SRM is even more into the future, even though there are some laboratory and few out-of-lab experiments. So my question is, if you really think about it, if you're supposed to have an equivalent of 200 gigatons carbon removal from the atmosphere over the coming years, how would the scale-up look? And from my knowledge of the history of technology, the problems and challenges only occur with the scale-up, and the costs only decline with the scale-up. And so we also don't know what to expect. It might increase the uncertainty because not all technologies will be successful. But I just wondered what you think about the scale-up. And let me give you another example related to Simone's presentation. I did the back-of-the-envelope calculation. If we would do the 10 million tons of sulfur injection into the stratosphere per year to avoid half a degree or a degree, as Simone said, you would need 500 to 1,000 aircraft that would fly at 25-kilometer altitude. None of that exists except for the few spy planes. So the scale-up really concerns me, not just the early deployment and feasibility, but also how much can these technologies realistically contribute. So if you don't mind, maybe you can react to this question. Do you want to start with Holly and go in the other direction?
Yeah. I mean, maybe to join your question with the last one a little bit, there's a recent paper by Wake Smith, who I saw give a talk at Harvard last week, that looked at the production of these aircraft and is it even possible to design and manufacture that aircraft in time to forestall some of these tipping points? And so to me, that's kind of a wake up, because for a long time, I've been working on this topic for 15 years, and we treated it like science fiction, like really in the future. But I do think there's an urgency to the research, because maybe it's, it gets to be too late sometime pretty soon. So I don't want us to just think of it as a future-oriented activity. I think it demands research now, but with the scaling challenges apply to everything, even things like afforestation. I was interviewing somebody who was trying to do an afforestation project, and she was trying to procure enough seeds, and she was talking to these nurseries about the supply of these seeds, and they said, well, it takes 3 to 5 years to have that many seeds because oak trees only produce so many. So even things that seem like natural and simple, there's a scale-up material component to it.
Yeah, I mean, time is our major constraint, I think, from that point of view. Hidetaka, did you want to comment? And then we go to Simone.
Okay, I would like to talk about the scaling up challenge. So, for example, direct air capture and storage, that would be easier for scaling up compared with other nature-based solutions. But even the DACs, scaling up would be big challenge because the scaling up speed is too fast compared with conventional industry. So for not only engineering problem, we have to consider about water consumption and resources for plant, nickel or something, metal sources. So my point is that not only one measure, we have to we have to take every possible measure to counterbalance how to abate emissions. Okay.
Thank you. Simone?
Yeah, I think following up on what Dr. Buck said, on Wake Smith, for example, there are people that talk about how fast could we really scale up SAI, or solar radiation modification. And we did some calculations together with him as well, thinking about when we do the modeling, right? We say, okay, we'll try to keep temperature at a certain level. Say we start in 10 years, assuming that works. How many airplanes would we need? How much do we need to produce? And it often turns out that many estimates are, since there's a large uncertainty, there's also large uncertainty. How fast can you actually scale up and build aircraft? How many aircraft do you need? So in the end, the question is, if we really wanted, could we actually keep temperatures at a certain level? It's still to be decided. Could we actually keep our temperatures from reaching over 1.5 at this point anymore with SAI? Can we actually implement it fast enough? And I think that's the question. For instance, the idea is, yes, maybe we can use aircraft that don't have to fly that high. We could use existing aircraft that start emitting in higher latitudes. They don't have to fly so high to get into the stratosphere. And so that may actually help to start this process earlier. But does it actually mean that we can sustain the temperature increase that we have right now through greenhouse gas emissions, that concentrations that still are increasing right now, right? So that's the question, what can we achieve? And that's what the research is really needed. As everybody said here, again, over and over, mitigation is the most important part. How much can these additional technologies do is the big question. How much can they actually cool? And then, of course, what would be the impacts at the same time? If we go really drastic about this and emit a lot, then, of course, we also have more impacts and side effects.
Thank you. Great discussion, but I'm afraid we are slowly running out of time. We only have 10 minutes, so we'll take 3 questions. Ismail was first, then Vali second, and then the third would like to take 1 question from the internet. So please, short questions if possible, and very short answers. Is there a mic somewhere? Well. Okay, can you just give him the mic? Yeah.
Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. I have just 2 related questions of 2 parts. One is, as we envisage these technologies or these activities that would impact on reducing the heating of the earth and so on, are we looking at the alternative side effects? For example, afforestation, although planting forests is very nice, but ultimately, if you plant a trillion forest trees, you will reduce the albedo of the earth, which is reflecting back a significant amount of solar radiation. So, that these actions are not unilateral. If you create the equivalent of a permanent volcano eruption up in the stratosphere, will that impact on our ability to grow food? I mean, there are these kinds of questions, and the uncertainties on these things are very severe. And ultimately, once you put up all that stuff in the stratosphere, how do you take it down if you turn out that you put too much of it up there? These are very serious questions about why we should be approaching this with a great deal of caution, and only very rigorous science would do.
Yeah, it's an intervention in the climate system, so potentially huge dangers. Let's take Vali's question in the back, 1 seat. Yeah.
Thank you, Naki. My question was basically covered by Ismail, so I'm not going to take the time.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me then read the question from the internet, and then all of you, please, quick answers if possible. So the question from the internet is a little bit related to our upscaling discussion. I'll just read it. A lot of private investment go to direct air capture nowadays, but it seems that this is one-time trend. What do you think, whether this trend would stop unless the costs can be reduced massively in the future? So one after the other, you want, please. Yeah.
Yes, I think now it's like a trend, but the CDR requirement continue to 2050 and more. So trend is true, but the demand and the requirement, I think it continue. Okay?
Yeah. Any other responses, in particular to Ismail's and Vali's question? Simone, do you want to go next?
I was just the question. One of the question is how fast. What do we do with afforestation and so on? I think it's a valid question. We need to simulate this. There are starting to be model simulation also that combine SAI and CDR, but that's something we haven't done yet. So there's way more research, as already said. And so, I think it's a concern to really, we don't have the answers yet. We do know some things, but there's way more research, modeling research, as well as experimental research needed.
Yeah, and Holly, any reactions from you?
Just in terms of investment in direct air capture, I think it could depend a bit on whether other things like sustainable aviation fuels become cheaper, so there's a relative comparative dimension, but also just to underscore that we would need really strong policy like a price on carbon, like many other measures to, if we wanted to see it scale, because it wouldn't scale naturally like solar, for example, where you clearly get something you can use from it. It's more akin to waste management.
Yeah, thank you. There are lots of challenging questions that I wish we would have had time to discuss. I mean, Ismail's question, for example, if you do artificial volcanoes, how quickly can we get rid of them? My understanding is maybe 10 years it would take for it to be filtered out of the stratosphere, but who knows? But we are changing the system. I know that from climate models, and Simone knows that better than me, they indicate serious climate change also from the intervention. You know, there would be regional weather pattern changes. They even might influence monsoon in the grand scale, ocean with continuous acidification. So the challenges are really huge. I mean, the best is to avoid. So mitigation, adaptation is number one, and this can be complementary. So I think we are coming to the conclusion of the session. I would like to ask the speakers if they have very brief, less than 1 minute, final remarks, and maybe you can pose new questions for us to think about in the future.
Okay, finally, I would like to point out only one point. I already talked in the presentation. Moral hazard is, yeah, certainly a risk, but this risk may delay CDR deployment. This is also a risk, I think. Okay.
I guess I'll just end with another encouragement to consider the social and invest in it, even though it could add additional costs to projects. For example, it's really important that these first-of-a-kind projects be demonstrating not just that the technology works, but that these projects can be beneficial for people and for communities. And it would be really tragic if all the great innovation that we've heard about that people in this room are doing doesn't get deployed because of these social considerations.
Thank you. Simone?
Yeah, in terms of solar radiation management, definitely something that we need to research in much more detail to understand it. But we need to keep always in mind that if there's any chance that these technology may actually benefit, it's something to consider. So that means more research is required to understand it, and not right away dismiss it in terms of saying this is way too uncertain, because we are making progress in our understanding, and more research will give us more answers. So I think that's still also a promising thought.
Thank you. So what I really worry about, if I may just at this concluding part mention, one is the termination shock, because it's not clear that we would have appropriate governance for these systems. That would even include the direct air capture, but in particular SRM. But once you start doing it, you're kind of committed, even if it's possible, and if we stop, that would be really detrimental. And the other one is the moral hazard. Also for research, not just for deployment, because there is a risk if we invest quite a lot in this in research in these technologies, that might reduce the research effort in mitigation and adaptation. So I think there is a lot to think about. But I would like to ask Reiko if she has final comments.
Yes, I think it's the same. You know, in the past it may be science fiction, but now we may need that frontier technologies. Do we really want to give some fundings for these? Perhaps we should, but we have to think about it, you know, and how to do scale up. And AI may help us, but AI data requires more and more energy. That you have to think about it as well. So I think what is important is also has to exchange our opinions in the different stakeholders. You know, not necessarily scientists, of course, and engineers, but some biologists or chemists, all this, but also other sections, humanities, and all have to discuss, and also we have to have young generation to be within the discussion. So that is the important thing, but we need new technologies, but has a moral hazard and a lot of risk. We have to know about it. Yeah. That is a roundup.
Thank you, but I'm afraid that part of it is still science fiction. If you think about the space mirrors, I remember that like 30 years ago, I got a proposal from Tupolev to tow asteroids in the Earth's orbit to make the space mirrors. Yes. Well, we are at the end of the session, I'm afraid. There is so much to discuss, but I thought it was a really important and timely topic, and I hope that we can continue this discussion because we have to understand the potential benefits, but also the huge risks, and we perhaps need a risk approach to understand really the importance of these technologies, and that is essential for guaranteeing the cool Earth in the future. So I think this is part of our portfolio. And then my final words would be, of course, to thank our speakers for fantastic presentations, for keeping on time, and I would like to thank the audience for being very active and participatory, and also our colleagues over the internet who are there. And last but not least, the organizers. I think it was a fantastic, it all worked really well. Thank you very much, and all the best.